The fluorescent lights hummed their electric prayer above the pediatric unit at Oak Creek Memorial, a sound that had become as familiar to Laura Bennett as her own heartbeat after 15 years of night shifts. She stood at the nurse's station in worn scrubs, charting vitals for the 3 children sleeping down the corridor, her movements economical and certain, the muscle memory of someone accustomed to working under pressure where wasted motion meant wasted seconds. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the precision of a surgeon, each keystroke deliberate, each notation complete. Nobody watching would have guessed that those same hands had once secured a tourniquet around a Marine's shattered femur while artillery shook the ground beneath her boots. Nobody watching would have guessed anything at all, and that was exactly how Laura kept it. She touched the dog tag beneath her scrubs without thinking. The chain was broken, had been for 20 years, one link severed by shrapnel on a hillside in Helmand Province that officially didn't exist on any map. The tag itself bore a name that wasn't hers, had never been hers, not legally, not officially. She wore it for one reason, to remind herself what she'd carried out of Marjah, what she'd walked 11 miles through hostile territory to protect, what she'd left behind when the classified operation was buried so deep that Major Laura Bennett ceased to exist in any government database that mattered. A ghost taking vital signs at 3 in the morning. A phantom in scrubs, invisible to the physicians who consulted on cases, invisible to the administrators who did their rounds in daylight, visible only to the patients who needed help in the dark hours when nobody else was watching. Dr. Marcus Caldwell swept through the unit at 7:15 that evening, before the day shift fully handed off to night, his white coat moving like a sail in his wake. He was the kind of doctor who commanded rooms without speaking, not through any genuine competence but through the architecture of privilege, Georgetown education, a family name that appeared on the hospital's board letterhead, a reputation built on taking impossible cases and declaring them impossible with the confidence of someone who'd never experienced a consequence. He moved past Laura's station without acknowledging her, which was the way of things. Physicians didn't see nurses like her, not the middle-aged ones who kept their heads down and their observations to themselves. They saw uniforms and credentials, hierarchies, and professional distance. They didn't see hands. They didn't see training. They didn't see anything that might challenge the careful architecture of their authority. The alert came through the intercom at 7:40, soft and bureaucratic, pediatric admission, room for 12. Winters family, incoming now. Laura looked up from her documentation, that simple reflex that all nurses develop after enough years, the attention to detail that sorted which admissions required immediate preparation and which could wait. Room for 12 was already set up for a long-term case, ventilator rails installed, monitoring equipment positioned. She made a note to check the oxygen concentrator, to ensure the suction equipment was accessible and functional, the way her hands moved toward these tasks before her mind fully caught up with the instruction. The stretcher wheeled through the double doors at 7:53. The father pushed it, a man built like the Marines don't quite make anymore, barrel-chested and broad-shouldered but moving with the careful precision of someone carrying something precious and fragile. His face bore the particular lines of someone who'd spent years trying to fix what couldn't be fixed, and his eyes held the terrifying clarity of a parent watching their child disappear into a medical mystery. Behind the stretcher walked a girl in the wheelchair they'd transferred her into for safer mobility, her body supported by pillows that probably cost more than Laura's monthly rent, her small frame diminished by the paraphernalia of chronic illness, the feeding tube, the Foley catheter, the wrist splints to prevent contracture deformities. Laura saw the girl's eyes first. That was the mistake, the moment that compromised 15 years of careful invisibility. The eyes were the shape of someone specific, angled slightly inward, with that particular determined set that belonged to an infant she'd shielded with her own body during a mortar attack 2 decades ago, an infant she'd carried 11 miles through hostile territory with nothing but a single dog tag on a broken chain to identify the father. Her fingers froze on the dog tag. 3 full seconds. Long enough to be noticeable if anyone was watching, which nobody was. The Winters family was focused on Caldwell, who'd materialized in the hallway with the timing of a practiced entrance, and the transfer crew was already leaving, and the evening shift nurses were giving report, and the world continued its rotation around Laura's sudden, complete immobility. The girl's name was Keira. She was 12 years old. The father's name was Tom Winters, and when he looked at his daughter there was the specific brand of desperation that only Marine fathers carried, the kind that came from being trained to solve problems through force and action, and then learning that some problems had no military solution. Keira Winters, Caldwell said, reading from the chart with the tone of someone cataloguing inventory. Rare autoimmune disorder affecting the spinal cord. Onset began at age 10. Progressive paralysis. He looked at the girl with a clinical assessment of someone examining a disease rather than a child. The MRI shows severe demyelination across CF4 through L2, consistent with what we call ADEM, acute disseminated encephalomyelitis. The differential is limited. We've had 3 specialists consult. Tom Winters leaned forward. What does that mean? What's the treatment protocol? Caldwell's smile was the smile of a man about to deliver bad news with the satisfaction of someone who'd already decided nothing could be done. It means, he said, that we've exhausted the conventional options. The spinal inflammation has caused irreversible damage to the neural pathways. The paralysis is permanent. The question now isn't recovery, it's comfort care. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. We'd recommend discussing hospice placement. Focus on quality of life rather than aggressive treatment. The room went absolutely still. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of something essential stopping. Keira's small hand reached for her father's. Tom Winters' jaw tightened with the specific tension of a man being told that the enemy had won and no amount of training could change the outcome. Laura's hands moved without consultation from her conscious mind. She was across the room, assessing the stretcher positioning, ensuring the transfer was stable, her movements so smooth and practiced that they became invisible, the kind of nursing work that was only noticed if it failed to happen. She wasn't thinking about the Marjah hillside or the infant she'd carried or the way her entire carefully constructed life had just cracked open in the space of 3 seconds. She was thinking about the positioning of the child's cervical spine, the pressure points for a girl who couldn't move, the prevention of decubitus ulcers that would kill her just as surely as the paralysis might. Muscle memory took over. This was what she knew. This was what she did. It wasn't until Caldwell was finished with his pronouncements and moving toward the exit that the next moment arrived, the one that would become important later, though neither of them knew it yet. Laura touched the father's shoulder, the briefest contact, her voice pitched low and level, without inflection or emotion. The MRI imaging from Kandahar, she said. The field hospital there. I saw a protocol. Caldwell turned. His face was exactly the color of old marble. When he spoke, his voice was soft, which made it worse, the softness of someone absolutely certain of his position. Nurse Bennett, he said, and the way he said her name was a category of dismissal. Your role in this unit is to provide comfort care and monitor vital signs. It is not to practice medicine. It is not to suggest protocols outside your scope. And it is certainly not to contradict my clinical assessments in front of families. He smiled again, that cold arrangement of teeth. Do you understand? Yes, doctor, Laura said. Her composure was absolute. Her hands were steady. Her voice didn't waver. The trembling, the thing that someone might have misidentified as fear or rage, was actually something else. It was the trembling of restraint. It was the trembling of a woman who'd learned the hard way that some battles weren't won with words, and some victories required a patience that looked like surrender. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Tom Winters turned back to his daughter's bedside, and Caldwell left through the double doors, and Laura returned to the nurse's station where the fluorescent lights continued their electric prayer, and the machinery of Oak Creek Memorial continued spinning forward, indifferent to everything that had just changed beneath its lights. She touched the dog tag again. The broken chain was still intact. The tag itself bore a name that still didn't match any database that mattered. And somewhere in a child's eyes, Laura Bennett saw the exact moment from 20 years ago, and understood that some ghosts don't get to stay buried. The morning rounds began at 7:15, the kind of sterile institutional rhythm that had marked every Tuesday and Thursday since Laura arrived at Oak Creek Memorial. Dr. Caldwell moved through the pediatric ward with the precise choreography of someone who had spent 2 decades convincing himself that precision was the same thing as care. His white coat hung like armor. His stethoscope was a scepter. Behind him trailed residents and medical students, their pens poised, their eyes trained downward in the way of those who had learned early that paying attention to the wrong thing could cost them everything. Laura stood outside Keira's room, room 412, southeast corner, window overlooking the parking lot where rain was beginning to gather in the gutters. The girl was awake, her small frame propped at a 45-degree angle, her eyes tracking the movement of a ceiling-mounted television playing something animated and deliberately cheerful. Sergeant Major Tom Winters sat in the vinyl recliner beside the bed, the kind of chair that crackled with every shift of weight, and he had not left his daughter's side in 48 hours except to use the bathroom. There were deep grooves under his eyes. His uniform hung loose. His hands, calloused from 23 years of service, trembled slightly as he adjusted Keira's blanket for the 100th time. Laura had the patient chart open on her tablet, the vitals from the night shift rendering in blue text, oxygen saturation holding at 91% on supplemental oxygen, heart rate elevated at 104, a slight fever creeping back despite the antipyretics. The notes from neurology read like a death sentence written in clinical language. Untreatable. Progressive. Recommend comfort care. Recommend hospice. The words stacked like stones on a grave that hadn't been dug yet. Dr. Caldwell stopped at the doorway, and his presence moved through the room like a change in barometric pressure. He was tall, with the kind of jawline that belonged to men who had never questioned whether the world owed them anything, because the world had always said yes. He looked at Keira with the expression of someone examining a car whose transmission had finally failed. Terminal. Write off. Move to the next patient. Sergeant Major. Caldwell nodded, a gesture that contained the exact right amount of sympathy and none of the warmth that sympathy actually required. How is our little warrior this morning? Keira's eyes brightened at the sound of his voice. Children did that, they saw white coats and titles and believed those things meant salvation. It would be a hard lesson. She had a restless night, Tom said quietly. Temperature spiked to 103 at around 3 in the morning. Nurse Bennett stayed close. Got it down with cold compresses and fluids. Laura had stayed close. She had sat in the hard plastic chair beside Keira's bed from 2:30 until 6:45, watching the girl's chest rise and fall, listening to the ventilator hiss its mechanical rhythm, and doing something she had not done in 20 years, she had prayed. Not the formal prayers of Sunday services, but the raw, wordless prayers that came from the part of her that still remembered what it felt like to hold an infant against her body while bullets punched through the metal walls of a Humvee, to carry that impossibly small life through 11 miles of hostile territory with nothing but a single dog tag on a broken chain to prove anyone would come looking if she didn't make it. Nurse Bennett, Caldwell said, and his voice took on the tone of someone about to deliver a verdict he had already written. Walk me through the night's progression. Laura stepped forward. She had prepared for this, rehearsed the clinical narrative in her mind during those hours of watching Keira sleep. Objective data. Specific interventions. Measurable outcomes. This was how you spoke to men like Caldwell, in their language, with their metrics, stripped of anything that might sound like passion or connection or the kind of instinct that came from having learned medicine in a field tent with mortar shells screaming overhead. Fever began at 10:45 p.m., Laura said, her voice steady as a gyroscope. I initiated cooling protocol immediately. Cold saline in the peripheral 4, placed ice packs at the neck and groin. Monitored core temperature every 15 minutes. By 3:20 a.m., we were down to 101.2. By 5:40, it stabilized at 99.6. I also reviewed the research you cited regarding autoimmune-mediated neurological decline, and there's a field hospital protocol. Nurse Bennett. Caldwell's interruption was soft, the way a velvet rope is soft. Your role is to empty bedpans, not practice medicine. Perhaps you'd like to share your medical school credentials. The words landed exactly as he intended. He was not raising his voice. He was not being crude. He was being surgical. Behind him, the residents' pens froze. A medical student actually took a half step back. Tom Winters' face went white the way a face goes white when it has just absorbed something it cannot process. Laura took one measured breath. She did not look away from Caldwell's eyes. She let a single tear escape, not trembling, not breaking, just a single bead of salt water that traced the line of her cheekbone while her expression remained absolutely still. She wiped it away without looking down, without acknowledging it, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her voice, when she spoke, was the voice of someone who had already survived things that would have shattered most people into fragments. "I understand, Doctor," she said quietly. "Some people need to remind others of hierarchy because it's all they have." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when someone says something true and everyone in the room knows it. Tom Winters made a small sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob. Caldwell's jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second, and then he turned on his heel and moved to the next room, his entourage scattering behind him like frightened birds. Laura did not move. She stood in the doorway with her hands empty at her sides and her composure intact, and inside her chest something called tighter, the way a spring coils when you wind it beyond its tolerance. She had learned long ago that there was a cost to winning arguments with men like Caldwell. You might win the battle, but you would lose the war. You might make them look foolish in front of their subordinates, but you would pay for it in ways that were subtle and systematic and absolutely devastating. The next day, Laura arrived at her shift at 6:55 a.m. to find a printed memo posted on the unit board in the staff area. Red marker. Her name circled. The message read, "Nurse L. Bennett, formal documentation of overstepping scope of practice. Patient care decisions are the sole domain of attending physicians. Continued violations will result in termination proceedings." It was dated the morning after rounds and signed by Dr. Marcus Caldwell, Chief of Neurology. She read it once. She did not react. She did not cry. She simply photographed it with her phone, then moved on to retrieve her assignment. By Wednesday afternoon, she was sitting alone in the break room, a container of cold rice and vegetables in front of her, when 3 nurses and 2 residents entered to retrieve their lunches from the refrigerator. They saw her. They registered her presence. And then, as if responding to a signal she could not hear, they gathered their food and left. The chairs scraped deliberately against the linoleum. No one spoke. No one met her eyes. Laura continued eating. She did not look up. She did not flinch. Muscle memory did not take over because this was not the kind of thing muscle memory could solve. This was institutional erasure happening in real time, the slow systematic dismantling of someone's professional existence by a man who had decided that her competence was a threat to his authority. By Friday, Caldwell had begun calling her Bedpan Bennett during shift changes, and she had heard him use the nickname 3 times, once in front of 6 staff members, once in front of Sergeant Major Winters, once in front of Keira, who had asked quietly if that was a mean name and if people were being mean to the nurse lady who stayed up with her at night. Laura had knelt beside the wheelchair and taken the girl's small hand and said, "It doesn't matter what people call you, sweetheart. What matters is what you know about yourself. And I know you're the bravest person on this unit." Keira had squeezed her fingers and whispered, "Even braver than the doctors." Even braver than the doctors, Laura had said. That evening, Caldwell approached her as she was updating the medication log. Keira's condition had deteriorated further, the fever returning despite the antipyretics, her oxygen saturation dropping to 88% despite supplemental oxygen at 8 liters, the subtle signs of organ failure beginning to manifest in the blood work. Laura had spent her lunch break reviewing every field hospital protocol she had ever learned, every technique she had used in places where the only difference between saving a life and losing it was the person willing to see the patient as a human being instead of a diagnostic code. "Bennett, I've reviewed your notes from the past 72 hours, Caldwell said, his voice pitched to carry to the nurses around her. "Stick to what you know, which based on your performance reviews, isn't much." He did not wait for a response. He simply moved past her toward the medication dispensary, leaving the words hanging in the recycled hospital air like smoke that would not clear. Tom Winters had been standing at the end of the hallway, waiting for the evening visiting hours to end so he could return to his daughter's room. He had heard every word. And when Laura glanced up to find him watching her, she saw something shift in his face, a recognition, a question, the beginning of understanding that the woman in the blue scrubs with a dog tag beneath her collar might be something more than what Dr. Caldwell was telling everyone she was. The double shift stretched into a third one without permission. Laura had simply stopped leaving. The pediatric unit needed her, or more precisely, Keira needed her, and the distinction no longer mattered. She moved through the hallway past the nurse's station with the efficiency of someone who had made difficult choices under fire, efficient, purposeful, erasing herself from notice. The fluorescent lights cast everything in a pale institutional glow that made the monitors glow like angry eyes. She checked Keira's vitals at 2,200 hours, then again at 0300, then again when the child's breathing began to shallow into something that wasn't quite normal anymore. The oxygen saturation had drifted to 94%. Not critical. Not yet. But sliding. Dr. Caldwell had been by that afternoon, a brief, clinical visit where he'd spent less than 4 minutes reviewing Keira's chart while standing at the foot of her bed, never touching her, never meeting her eyes. He'd written something in the chart, his pen moving with the precision of someone signing a death warrant, and then he'd left. Laura had waited until he was gone before reading what he'd documented. Continue current comfort care protocol. Recommend palliative care consultation. Prognosis remains grave. Family should prepare for deterioration. The word sat on the page like stones at the bottom of a grave. Comfort care. That was the vocabulary they used when they decided someone wasn't worth fighting for anymore. Keira's mother had stopped coming around on day 4. The stepmother came instead, the kind of woman who sat in the corner scrolling through her phone, her presence a legal formality rather than any kind of vigil. Tom Winters came every night around 1800 hours, wheeling himself into his daughter's room with the posture of a man carrying a broken country on his shoulders. He never stayed long. 10 minutes. 15 if Keira was awake. He'd look at her the way soldiers looked at fallen comrades, with a grief so specific it could cut glass. Laura recognized that look because she'd worn it herself, in places with names like Sanjin Valley and Helmand Province, in hospitals that weren't hospitals but forward operating bases with concrete floors and a shortage of everything except morphine and despair. She'd taken to sitting in the break room at 0400 hours when the night settled into its quietest rhythm, the coffee cold and bitter, her hands wrapped around the mug the way some people held onto prayers. The dog tag was still there beneath her scrubs, still resting against her collarbone, still carrying the weight of a choice she'd made 20 years ago in an airfield outside Marjah. That choice had a name now. That choice was sleeping 4 rooms down the hallway with an oxygen cannula under her nose and the kind of determination in her 12-year-old eyes that made Laura understand what mercy looked like when it wore the face of a child. The morning Keira crashed came in like any other morning. Routine exam. Caldwell wanted vitals before he rounded, wanted to show some movement in her case file even though the movement was all downward. Laura was already in the room when the resident arrived, a young man named Dr. Chen who moved with the hesitation of someone still learning to trust his own hands. She'd taken Keira's blood pressure at 06 for 5 hours, just to have a baseline, and it had been stable. 104 over 68. Normal for a 12-year-old. The oxygen saturation had crept up to 95% with supplemental O2, which meant the lungs were at least attempting cooperation. But the autonomic nervous system, the part of a body that makes decisions without asking permission, had been failing for hours, and Laura had known it the way soldiers knew when to move, when to freeze, when to trust the thing in their chest that wasn't fear but certainty. Keira's breathing changed at 0701 hours. Not deteriorated. Changed. The rhythm shifted from the steady in and out that lungs maintained on their own into something more fractured, less organized. Laura was writing in the chart when she heard it, a slight catch, the smallest hesitation in the space between inhales. She set the pen down and moved the 7 steps to Keira's bedside without appearing to hurry. The room held that particular quality of light that came just before dawn in hospitals, the moment when the night shift still held power but the day shift was beginning to gather its briefcase outside the elevator. The monitor beeped steady. 97 beats per minute. Then the oxygen saturation began its descent like a slow elevator moving down through the building of a body that was running out of reasons to stay conscious. 93. The monitor adjusted. 88. Laura's hands were already moving, steady as surgical lasers, reaching for the blood pressure cuff. 82. She pressed the call button. Not a panic button. Just a call. The kind of call a nurse makes when she's noticed something the attending needs to know about. Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway within 30 seconds. He saw the monitor first. His eyes widened. His hands began to move in the slightly jerky movements of someone whose training was still theoretical. Keira's lips were starting to lose color, the pink beginning to separate into something more blue, the color of a sky before a storm, the color of cyanosis, the color of a body that wasn't getting enough oxygen and was beginning to shut down the unnecessary systems to keep the vital ones alive. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath needle," Laura said. Her voice had changed. The deferential nurse who asked questions had been replaced by someone else entirely. Someone with authority that didn't require position. The resident moved. She was already using one gloved hand to palpate the space between Keira's second and third ribs, finding the landmarks. The first landmark was the angle of Louis where the ribs met the sternum, then moving along the second rib until she found the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line, the exact point where a needle would do the most good. Keira's eyes were open, conscious, terrified. "Look at me," Laura said, and the child's eyes found hers. "You're okay. Your body's just forgetting how to breathe right. We're going to remind it." The needle went in with a kind of precision that came from hands that had done this before, in places where light didn't work and infections were the least of anyone's worries. The hiss of air escaping, that specific exhalation that meant pressure was releasing, meant the lungs could expand again, meant a life was being brought back one small unit of atmospheric pressure at a time. The monitor began its climb. 78, 82. 88. Dr. Chen had the ambu bag now, the manual ventilator that looked like a soft rubber heart in his hands. Laura took it from him with a gesture that wasn't aggressive but was absolutely final. "Step back," she said. "Give her space." She began the rhythm that muscles remembered even when the mind tried to forget. In and out. The timing of it, the pressure, the specific amount of force that would move air into lungs without rupturing the delicate tissue inside them. Combat rhythm. The kind of rhythm you maintained in a medevac helicopter or a forward surgical team or a dust-off in helm and when the trauma surgeon was 3 hours away and you were the only thing standing between someone and the mercy of stopping. The monitor climbed. 92, 95. 98. Keira's lips began to pink again, the blue receding like a tide, like the color of a girl coming back from the edge of a place where colors didn't matter anymore. The code team never arrived. The crash cart remained where it lived, near the nursing station, ready but unnecessary. Laura maintained the rhythm for 47 minutes. The clock on the wall marked each minute with a discrete mechanical tick that only existed if you were listening for it. The room existed in a bubble that contained nothing but a child who was being breathed for, a nurse whose hands never wavered, and the steady climb of oxygen saturation as a body learned to remember what living felt like. By minute 47, Keira's own lungs had begun to coordinate with the ambu bag, had begun to take some of the work back, had begun to remember the biological imperative that didn't require thinking, just doing. Dr. Caldwell stood in the doorway. Laura didn't know how long he'd been there. 5 minutes. 10. Long enough to understand that he'd just watched something impossible happen, something unauthorized, something that had worked despite violating every principle of hierarchy and protocol he'd built his career on. His face held the specific expression of a man watching the architecture of his own authority crumble in real time. The code team arrived 5 minutes after Keira's lungs took over, after the immediate crisis had already been managed, after the room had already transitioned from emergency to recovery. They assessed quickly, documented faster, moved the child to the ICU with the professional efficiency of people who understood that Laura had done their work before they'd even known they were needed. Caldwell never moved from the doorway. He simply watched as they wheeled Keira out, and his eyes, cold blue, the color of winter and institutional distance, found Laura's for just long enough to communicate something that needed no words. She'd just made a choice that transcended every warning he'd given her, every policy he'd cited, every careful documentation of her stepping outside her role. She'd just saved his patient using methods he'd dismissed, using knowledge he'd decided she couldn't possibly possess, using hands that moved like someone who'd done this exact thing before in places that didn't officially exist. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that preceded consequences, the kind of silence that came right before a life changed shape entirely. Within 1 hour of pulling his hands from Keira's chest, Dr. Caldwell made 4 phone calls that sounded like destiny but were really just strategy. First call, to the hospital board's chairman, his college roommate, a man who'd borrowed money 3 times and paid back only twice. "We have a nursing liability issue," Caldwell said, his voice carrying the practiced concern of someone who'd perfected the art of sounding worried while doing damage. Second call, to HR, demanding an emergency termination hearing. "Unauthorized medical procedures," he said. "Repeated violations of scope of practice. She performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization." The words stacked like ammunition, each one true enough to land, all of them missing the point entirely. Third call, to security, restricting Laura Bennett's building access effective immediately, pending the termination hearing. His voice had gone quieter by then, the kind of quiet that comes from knowing you're winning. Fourth call, to the state nursing board, filing a formal complaint. "I believe this nurse represents a danger to patient safety," he told the intake officer, and the conviction in his tone made it sound like testimony instead of retaliation. Caldwell stood in his office after the last call, chest rising and falling like a predator who'd just marked territory, and he understood something fundamental about power. It wasn't about being right. It was about controlling the narrative before anyone else could write it. He'd watched Laura's hands move during that code, watched her know exactly where to place the needle, watched her manage the manual ventilation with the kind of rhythm that came from doing it before, doing it under fire, maybe, though that thought disappeared the moment it formed. He couldn't afford that thought. He couldn't afford to wonder what she was. So instead, he'd made 4 calls that added up to erasure. Laura sat in the break room during her lunch break, which she spent alone because everyone had learned to leave when she sat down. She folded and unfolded a piece of paper, the email notification that her termination hearing was scheduled for 3 p.m. that same day. She didn't need to read it again, the words had burned into her memory the moment they arrived. Unauthorized medical procedures. Repeated violations of scope of practice. It didn't say the real thing, of course. The real thing was that she'd challenged institutional authority. The real thing was that Caldwell had built his entire life on a hierarchy where his word was law and her job was to nod and comply, and she'd broken the one rule that mattered: never make the king look small in front of his subjects. She understood the pattern because she'd seen it before, in different uniforms, in different rooms, in places where the rules of power operated with even less restraint than a Houston hospital. The pattern was always isolate, document, weaponize policy, then remove the problem before it could become a threat. Caldwell was competent at this. He'd studied how power worked and built his entire career on leveraging it, the same way another man might learn to play chess. The only difference was that in chess, the pieces didn't bleed. The termination letter arrived at 2:45 p.m., printed on hospital letterhead, signed by HR and the board chairman with the kind of official finality that made it real. Effective immediately, your employment with Oak Creek Memorial is terminated for violations of nursing scope of practice and repeated insubordination toward medical staff. Please return all hospital property and submit to a final badge scan by end of shift. 23 years she'd trained for medicine, and 15 of those she'd given to this hospital, and it took exactly 2 pages to erase all of it. Laura didn't cry. She didn't even feel the urge to cry, which was its own kind of damage. Instead, she walked to the hospital laundry on the basement level at shift's end, carrying her 3 sets of scrubs, each one folded neatly. The laundry room smelled like bleach and industrial heat and something else underneath, the smell of things being cleaned, which seemed darkly funny somehow. The attendant, an older man with a 1st Marine Division tattoo covering his left forearm, was sorting colors from whites when she approached the return counter. Laura laid her scrubs down. The blue cotton was still warm from the dryer. She picked up the first set and folded it with the precision of someone who'd spent years folding things that mattered: field uniforms, dress uniforms, ceremonial flags. Each crease was exact. Each corner aligned. The man watched her fold without speaking, which was its own kind of respect. "You were military," he said. "Not a question." Laura's hands paused. 1 second. That was all. "Yes." "Long time ago." "Recent enough." She finished the second set. The third set. 3 perfect rectangles of blue cotton, each one a small death of something she'd built carefully over 15 years. "How long were you in?" 23 years, the attendant said. "Gunny. Combat engineer. Took a round in Fallujah that didn't quite kill me, so I got to come home and do laundry instead." He smiled like someone who'd made peace with unfair trades. "What did you do before nursing?" Laura's hand stilled on the third set of scrubs. She could have lied. She could have deflected with a joke or a vague answer. But there was something about the tattoo on his arm, something about the way he'd asked the question, like he already knew the answer was a wound, that made her tell the truth. "I kept people alive when everything was falling apart." The gunny nodded slowly, like that was the only answer worth giving. "Yeah," he said. "That tracks." She left Oak Creek Memorial through the staff entrance at 6:27 a.m., which was technically after shift end, but she'd wanted to wait until most people had gone home. The parking lot was nearly empty. The Houston sky was already turning the particular shade of pink it got in summer before the heat really settled in. She carried a single cardboard box that contained 15 years of civilian nursing, 2 photographs, a coffee mug with a pediatrics conference logo from 2019, a stethoscope she'd bought with her own money, a flash drive with research notes on experimental protocols she'd been planning to submit to journals. Below all of that, invisible in the bottom corner, was the dog tag on the broken chain. Dr. Caldwell sent an email to the entire medical staff at 3:15 p.m. that afternoon, his institutional authority already in the process of self-repair. The subject line read, "Staff Communication, Administrative Update." The body of the email was 3 sentences, effective immediately. Nursing staff member Laura Bennett has been terminated from her position due to repeated violations of scope of practice and inability to follow established protocols. This decision reflects our commitment to patient safety and maintaining clear professional boundaries within our medical team. Please direct any questions to Human Resources. The email was a masterpiece of institutional language. It said everything he needed it to say without actually saying anything true. A lie that hid inside the shape of facts. A story where he was reasonable and protective of patients and she was the problem. He'd sent it to everyone: surgeons, residents, nurses, technicians, custodial staff. By the time anyone who cared to look into it arrived to examine what had actually happened during that code, the narrative would already be written and filed and accepted as truth by everyone who hadn't been there. Tom Winters sat in Keira's hospital room at 9 p.m. that same evening, watching his daughter sleep with the kind of attention that only comes from a parent who spent months wondering if the next breath would be the last one. The room was dark except for the monitor glow. O2 sat at 94%, heart rate steady at 72, blood pressure holding at 102/68. Stable. Because of Laura Bennett. Because of what she'd done when the crash cart failed and the code team froze and his daughter's lips started turning the color of slate. He pulled out his phone and opened the browser. He'd had access to classified military databases since his promotion to Sergeant Major, databases that most civilians didn't even know existed. He entered a name in the search field, Bennett, LD. He added parameters, USMC, major rank, female, served 2000 to 2025. The screen flashed red. Access denied, protected operative, record sealed by order of Naval Intelligence. Tom's entire body went still. Protected operative. Sealed records. The words carried weight that civilians didn't understand. The military didn't seal records lightly. They sealed them for people who'd done things that needed staying buried. They sealed them for people who'd been erased. He thought about the way Laura had moved during that code. The precision. The knowledge. The combat rhythm of manual ventilation that came from having done it before, really done it, not just in training but in the field when lives depended on speed and muscle memory, and the kind of composure that only came from people who'd already looked into the darkness and negotiated with it. He made 3 more calls. First to the Commandant of the Marine Corps directly, a privilege that came with his rank and the favors he'd accumulated over 28 years of service. Second to Naval Intelligence, asking for the officer liaison. Third to his own commanding officer, asking a single question with his voice kept level and professional: "Sir, why is Major Laura Bennett, callsign Lighthouse, working as a civilian nurse under protective erasure at Oak Creek Memorial in Houston?" The silence on that line lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then his commanding officer said, "Sergeant Major, you need to understand something. That information is classified above your clearance level. But if she's surfaced and someone's going after her, that is a problem the highest levels of command need to know about immediately." And then that line went dead, and Tom Winters was still holding the dog tag chain in his other hand, the metal cold against his palm, understanding finally why the engraving on the back had been so worn that he'd had to feel it with his thumb for 20 years instead of reading it: Bennett LOPOS, USMC. The phone calls moved fast after that, the way they did in the military when protocol met necessity. A Black Hawk was being prepped at Ellington Field before midnight. 2 Marine officers were getting their dress uniforms pressed. A Navy SEAL commander was pulling classified files from secure servers. An FBI agent was getting authorization to make an arrest. And Laura Bennett was getting ready for a day she'd been told would never come, sleeping in her apartment in a city that hadn't recognized her, carrying a secret that was about to explode into the light with the force of an aircraft carrier arriving at port. The Black Hawk descended through Houston's pre-dawn darkness like a judgment coming home. Rotor wash hammered the oak trees surrounding Oak Creek Memorial's rooftop, sending leaves spiraling across the helipad in concentric patterns of wind and consequence. 2 Marine officers in dress blues, dress uniform with the particular precision that comes from standing in front of flags, walked straight through the hospital corridors at 5:51 a.m. without stopping at reception, without asking permission, their boots striking tile with the sound of authority that doesn't negotiate. They found Dr. Caldwell in his office reviewing the previous night's charts, and the senior officer, a full colonel with silver eagles on his collar, placed both hands on the desk and leaned forward with the kind of calm that precedes destruction. "We're looking for Major Laura Bennett. Callsign Lighthouse. You know where she is." Caldwell's face went the color of old hospital walls. He started to speak, then stopped. The colonel didn't wait for an answer. He'd already called it in. Within 6 minutes, Laura's address was being relayed to the FBI field office in downtown Houston, and the clock was running toward a moment that would reshape Oak Creek Memorial's entire hierarchy in ways no one could have predicted. In the hospital lobby at 6:15 a.m., before shift change, before the machines started their daily chorus of beeping and alarming, Sergeant Major Tom Winters positioned Keira's wheelchair near the information desk. His daughter was still asleep, her head tilted against the chair's side support, but in his hands he held something that had sustained him through 20 years of unanswered questions. A dog tag. A single piece of military-issued stainless steel on a broken chain, stamped with a name he'd spent 2 decades trying to find. He'd held it through 3 deployments, through the birth of his daughter, through the agony of watching her legs stop responding to her own commands. And now, finally, someone had told him that the woman who'd saved his daughter's life in the hospital was the same woman who'd carried his child through hostile territory in a country where, officially, Americans had never set foot. The elevator doors opened at 6:33 a.m. Laura stepped out in civilian clothes, jeans, a grey sweater, a single canvas bag containing everything she'd taken from the hospital. She'd planned to walk out of this building for the last time, to disappear back into whatever quiet corner of the city would have her, to live the rest of her life as a woman who'd been too educated for a nurse and too constrained by a uniform she couldn't wear. She didn't see Winters at first. She was thinking about the apartment application she'd filled out online, the one in the suburbs where the landlord probably wouldn't ask too many questions about her employment gap. Then a small voice, barely louder than hospital machinery, whispered, "Major." Laura turned. Keira's eyes were open now, fixed on her with an intensity that made time stop. The girl's hands trembled on the wheelchair's armrests. Not from palsy. From recognition. From something that transcended the 2 years of the child's life when Laura had been nothing but a night shift nurse who brought her medication and adjusted her pillows. Winters stood slowly, tears already streaming down his face, and opened a file folder with hands that shook like a man holding his own heartbeat. He began to read. The official document was stamped with classification marks that made security guards at the hospital in trance suddenly straighten to attention as they recognized the level of authority being invoked. Marjah extraction, 2003. 16 lives recovered. 1 infant child rescued from a compound 63 kilometers from the nearest Marine Forward operating base. Carried by a woman with a call sign like a lighthouse in the dark. That was you, Winters said, not asking. That was always you. A Navy SEAL commander walked through the hospital doors, and there was no mistaking what he was, because men like him carried their operational history in the way they moved, the way they assessed rooms and exits and threats with peripheral vision, and he stepped forward with his chest out and his voice like thunder compressed into a human chest cavity. Silver Star, he said, and every nurse in the vicinity turned to look. Bronze Star with Valor. He paused. The hospital's air conditioning hummed above them. Distinguished Service Cross for the Marjah operation. Each decoration was its own sentence. Each one hit like a revelation. A Silver Star. Another Silver Star. These weren't medals they handed out at retirement ceremonies. These were decorations for valor under fire, for decisions made in the space between heartbeats that had cost other people nothing because Laura Bennett had calculated the mathematics of survival better than anyone alive. 2 Purple Hearts, the SEAL commander continued, and his voice had changed now, had become something reverent, had become the way soldiers speak about people who have walked into the fire and come back out the other side. And a Navy Cross. The lobby went silent in a way that hospital lobbies never are. The silence was so complete that you could hear the fluorescent lights overhead, that almost inaudible electrical hum that most people never notice because it's the sound of buildings themselves breathing. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the doors burst open again. 2 Federal Bureau of Investigation agents in dark suits entered with the kind of unhurried authority that comes from the absolute certainty of institutional power. One of them was holding a folder thicker than a textbook. The other was speaking into a radio clip to his belt. And neither of them was looking at Laura. They walked directly to Dr. Caldwell, who had emerged from his office the moment he received word that something was happening in the main lobby, and they positioned themselves on either side of him with the precision of men who'd done this thousands of times. Dr. Marcus Caldwell, the first agent said, and each word fell like a gavel. You're under arrest for attempting to forge federal military records and filing false statements to discredit a protected operative under federal protective erasure. Caldwell's mouth opened. No sound came out. The younger FBI agent continued with the tone of a man reading a grocery list, because this was bureaucratic to him, this was paperwork and federal code and prosecutorial certainty. We've monitored every call you made to the hospital board's chairman. Every call to HR. Every call to the state nursing board. We have recordings of you deliberately falsifying documentation to strengthen your case against Major Bennett, knowing that she held classified operational status and that your actions were specifically designed to discredit a protected federal operative. The agent paused. That's a felony under Title 18, Section 1519. You attempted to destroy official records related to a federal investigation. I didn't know she was, Caldwell started, his voice cracking like old concrete, but the older agent cut him off with a movement of his hand that was almost casual. You weaponized institutional authority against someone whose service you'll never comprehend, the agent said, and there was no anger in his voice, which made it worse. There was only the absolute certainty of a man who had spent his career understanding how power gets abused by people who mistake their position for invulnerability. The handcuffs came out. They were stainless steel and they clicked around Caldwell's wrists with a sound like a door closing on an entire previous version of his life. He stumbled slightly, and neither agent caught him, and the entire hospital staff, nurses, techs, respiratory therapists, the morning shift arriving to start their 12-hour rotations, watched as the chief of neurology, the man who had reviewed their work and ordered their protocols and held their professional lives in his hands, was escorted toward the FBI sedan in the parking lot like a man walking into exile. Within 1 hour, the hospital board's chairman, the same college roommate who had taken Caldwell's phone calls in the darkness of early mornings when desperate men make desperate decisions, released a statement announcing Caldwell's immediate termination and the board's full cooperation with federal investigators. Within 3 hours, the hospital's CEO had personally visited the pediatric ward and found Laura standing by a window, looking down at the city she'd planned to escape from. "Major Bennett," he said, and the use of her actual rank seemed to change the air pressure in the room. "We were wrong. The hospital was wrong. And we're asking," he stopped. Took a breath. "Will you come back?" Laura turned from the window. Her face was the same as it had always been, composed, steady, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst things the world has to offer. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the CEO, then at the folder he was holding, then back at the Houston skyline where a Black Hawk was still circling, waiting. "I never stopped serving," she said finally, each word measured like medication being dispensed. "I just changed uniforms." A Marine general had arrived by then, the kind of senior officer whose presence made admirals check their posture, and he carried with him an official reinstatement order on paper that had been processed through offices with names that weren't on any public directory. He laid it on the table in front of Laura, and his voice was the kind of quiet that comes from decades of authority that doesn't need to raise itself. "Your country needs you, Major. Oak Creek Memorial needs you. And this child," he gestured toward Keira's room, where the girl was watching through a window with tears streaming down her face, "needs you most of all." Tom Winters approached with his daughter's wheelchair, and he knelt down in front of Laura with the kind of humility that only comes from a man who has finally found the answer to a question that has haunted him for 20 years. Tears streamed down his face like a man crying from his entire body, not just his eyes. "You saved her twice," he whispered. 20 years apart. The same hands. Laura knelt beside Keira's wheelchair and reached for her own neck. The dog tag she'd worn under every nurse's scrub, every night shift, every moment of this borrowed civilian life, she unclasped it. She reached for the broken chain that Tom Winters held, the one with his name and service number stamped into metal, and with movements that had the precision of someone who had worked with field equipment under fire. She took both dog tags and held them together while a Marine pulled a welding torch from a kit, and in the middle of Oak Creek Memorial's main lobby, with every witness in the hospital watching, he fused the broken chain back together into something whole. 2 years later, the night security desk at Oak Creek Memorial had a new occupant. Dr. Marcus Caldwell sat in a polyester uniform with the hospital's logo stitched onto the chest, checking visitor badges for the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift. His medical degree was stored somewhere in a warehouse with other confiscated things. His medical license had been permanently revoked. His reputation had been dismantled with the same precision he'd used to dismantle Laura's career, except that his downfall had been documented in federal court records and newspaper articles and the digital memory of an internet that never forgets. Through the lobby windows, he watched as Major Laura Bennett, dressed now in the white coat of Oak Creek Memorial's new Trauma Protocol Division Chief, with actual military insignia visible on her uniform beneath, knelt beside Keira Winters' wheelchair. The girl was taking her first assisted steps, the ones that Dr. Caldwell had said would never come, the ones that the experimental field hospital protocol had made possible. That broken dog tag chain, now welded whole, hung around both their necks like a symbol of something that transcended hierarchy and institutional authority and the fragile power of men who mistook their position for invulnerability. Keira took 3 steps. Then 4. Her legs trembled but held, and Laura whispered something that made the girl laugh, an actual laugh, the kind of pure sound that had no place in hospitals but belonged everywhere in the world. Tom Winters stood beside them in his dress blues, recording every step on his phone, tears streaming down his face like a man who had finally been given back what he thought had been lost forever. Laura glanced toward the security desk. Her eyes met Caldwell's for exactly 2 seconds. She nodded once, not forgiveness, because forgiveness requires a relationship, and she had never actually known him. But acknowledgement. Recognition that his fall had served a purpose. That the system that protected men like him had finally revealed itself as insufficient against the truth of who she was. The hospital's new chief of neurology, a former Navy trauma surgeon who understood that medicine was a calling and not a kingdom, walked past Caldwell's desk without recognition, heading to rounds with Laura's team. His name tag read Commander Reeves, MC, USN. He didn't pause. He didn't acknowledge the man at the security desk. He simply walked forward into a future where competence and compassion had returned to Oak Creek Memorial, where a wounded child was learning to walk again, where the quiet nurse with the unbreakable composure had finally come home. Laura removed her white coat at shift's end and touched the welded dog tag chain as Keira's laughter echoed through the corridors. The chain caught the light, two pieces of military steel fused into something stronger than either had been alone. And in that moment, in that quiet gesture, was the answer to every question about power and authority and what happens when a system finally encounters someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to give. If you've made it this far, you know what it costs to stand firm when everyone around you is demanding you bend. Share this with someone who needs to know that true strength isn't loud. Subscribe for more stories about the people who carry secrets that could change everything. And comment, what would you have done if you were standing in Laura's shoes? Would you have walked away, or would you have stayed and fought?